listener production. The world is watching on right now as anti-war protesters clash at Columbia University in New York, where police have been called and students have been arrested. Locally, university students have also set up encampments in support of Palestine and in solidarity with university students abroad. Student activism has a long history, often hotbeds of protests. What has changed in recent times? Is freedom of thought and speech at risk because universities are under pressure financially and from donors?
There's this narrative that student protest is over, that students are just apathetic, that they're consumers, that they're not as radical or concerned with the world as they were during the Vietnam War era. I think this is a real challenge to those notions. It shows that student protest is still vibrant and active.
That deep dive brought to you by Antoinette Lattouf and coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, Eleanor Harrison Dengate is here with the headlines. It is Friday, April 26.
Hey, Sasha. Coming out of the US this morning, Harvey Weinstein's 2020 rape conviction has been overturned after an appeals court found he didn't get a fair trial. The judge in the groundbreaking New York trial, which helped spark the Me Too movement, was found to have prejudiced the result because he allowed testimony from women who claimed Weinstein had assaulted them, even though they were not part of the charges he faced. The New York Court of Appeals has now ordered a retrial after a 4-3 decision. The court's majority said in its ruling it is an abuse of judicial discretion to permit untested allegations that destroys a defendant's character but sheds no light on their credibility as related to the criminal charges lodged against them.
So what this means is that some of Weinstein's accusers could have to take the stand again and relive their trauma. One of the founders of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, says she's devastated for the survivors linked to Weinstein's case and others around the world.
Because these brave women in this case broke their silence, millions and millions and millions of others found the strength to come forward and do the same.
We've also heard from lawyers for victims who say the decision to retry is a, quote, leap backwards and tragic. 72-year-old Weinstein remains in prison, and he will remain in prison because he's been separately convicted of rape in LA. Now, that happened last year, and that sentence was for 16 years. So just because this order from the Court of Appeals has come through for a retrial, it does not mean that Weinstein walks free right now, Eleanor.
And I guess with this kind of thing, that what always makes me irritated is I just always wonder how much money plays into this, in that how much does the appeals process cost? How much can Weinstein deal with that cost compared to, say, a normal person?
Yeah, and I also want to mention, you said that the decision was 4-3. So there were 3 judges in that appeals process who did not agree with ordering a retrial. One of them was Judge Madeline Singers. She said that the decision continues to thwart the steady gains of survivors of sexual violence and what they've fought for in the criminal justice system, which is such an important point. And the fact that this was the Me Too movement, this was what sparked it all, and the decision's been overturned is, I can only imagine for victim survivors, incredibly frustrating and traumatising. And a lot of people are going to be re-traumatised by this decision.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton has weighed in on the debate over whether the footage of the Wakeley church stabbing should be removed from the internet.
We can't be the internet police of the world. I know the Prime Minister's trying that at the moment, but we can have a say about what images are online here in our country. You can't influence what happens elsewhere in the world, and I think it's silly to try that.
On 2GB there. The E-Safety Commissioner has been in court this week arguing its legal order to remove the footage must apply to users anywhere in the world, not just Australia. It argues it needs to have overseas reach because freely available technology can circumvent any Australia-only geo-blocks, aka VPNs, which about 25% of Australians use. But X is fighting the directive. Elon Musk is saying it's global censorship. Dutton's comments not only put him at odds with the Commission, Commissioner, but also with his own deputy, Susan Lee, who said yesterday she backs the e-safety Commissioner 100%.
I was surprised by this because Dutton also said last weekend that there was a bipartisan position on tougher action against social media companies, which I think a lot of people took to mean that he was kind of standing with the government on this and the e-safety Commissioner. Look, earlier this week, X was ordered to hide the identified material worldwide until the next hearing on May 10. While X did not appear to comply with a similar order that was made on Monday. Now, Eleanor, kicking around late yesterday, we actually saw and heard from the man who is the subject of this video, the Sydney bishop who was stabbed. Let's have a listen to what he thinks.
I do not condone any acts of terrorism or violence. However, noting our God-given right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion, I'm not opposed to the videos remaining on social media.
Yeah, so an interesting take there from the bishop who, I mean, I've seen the footage. It is full on. And he's saying, you know what, it can stay up. I understand why there's opposition to it being pulled down.
Also, the implications of one jurisdiction in the world being able to take something down from the rest of the world. I mean, Australia, you know, we're a well-developed country. We've got a very strong legal system. But, I mean, if you are going to apply that to every other country in the world where there's, you know, varying political biases, varying levels of political corruption, and then you're sort of saying a company like Twitter is going to have to be beholden to all of those jurisdictions, I can see why this is contentious. Working Aussies are already doing it tough, and now a new report shows we're dealing with the biggest tax increase in the developed world. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has released the data revealing we saw a 7.6% increase in our average tax rates this year. So the second largest rise has been recorded across the ditch, a 4.5% in New Zealand. So we're really leading the pack here. I'm not sure I'm happy about that. The OECD's put it down to two factors: the end of the low middle income tax offset and bracket creep, which is when inflation pushes our income into that higher tax bracket. So the stage 3 tax cuts, though, that are meant to come into effect on July 1 are expected to deal with that, deliver some tax relief. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers has said that that means the average tax rate will fall from 25.4% to 23.9%. So as far as he's concerned, everything's fine.
Yeah, okay. Interestingly, a handful of sectors are helping drive up the inflation rate. Petrol's one, so, you know, a form of oil. Also, this one really stood out to me. Oils and fats, as in olive oil, sunflower oil, are also helping drive inflation because the cost of those have been pushed up by the war in Ukraine. That's really interesting. 4 pods of pilot whales will be monitored from the air off the coast of WA today after over 100 were saved following a mass beaching event. Around 160 came ashore across 500 metres of beach at Toby's Inlet near Dunsborough in the state's south yesterday morning. Hundreds of volunteers descended on the beach to help rescue efforts, and in the end, more than 130 were saved, and they did make it back out to sea, but sadly, 28 died.
But the good news is it so far looks like the surviving whales have made it successfully back out to deeper ocean, and a spotter plane was reporting late yesterday that the pods could no longer be seen near the surface. So that is good news.
Work is going to be done to figure out why this happened. There's often a lot of questions when we see mass beaching events. Sometimes it can be because one of the whales is sick and the pod follows it into shallow water, but samples will be taken from the deceased whales to help determine why the stranding occurred. Quickly before we go, in other news out of Europe that's, not the most important thing, but I found quite interesting seeing the images this morning. The Moulin Rouge, the iconic cabaret in Paris, it's got that iconic windmill that sits on the top. The sails of the windmill have fallen off and no one knows why. There's all these images going around this morning of the sails just sitting on the floor in front of the Moulin Rouge. That's just a little interesting tidbit.
It seems kind of random because it's like nothing happened. They just fell off. No one's been hurt. The building's not going to collapse. They've just fallen off.
Said to become one of our modern mysteries, perhaps. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here and thank you for all your work on the briefing. It is your last day with us. We appreciate everything you've done for us as an amazing producer. So thank you and all the best on your new endeavours. Next up, it is our deep dive with Antoinette Lattouf looking at the protests happening at universities around the world.
Hi, Antoinette Lattouf with you. So you may have seen the footage of more than 100 student protesters arrested at Columbia University. So the police were called in to break up pro-Palestine protesters and to stop the students from camping in the quadrangle. Classes are now all online in what's been described as a crisis. And other universities across the United States have also banned pro-Palestine anti-war protests, including Yale. This week, the University of Sydney, students there set up camp in solidarity with those from Columbia University. They too are calling for an end to the university's ties with Israel. Students have a long and passionate history of taking to the streets to protest various causes. So why is this response so divisive? To examine what's changed about protest culture at universities and what this means for free speech and academic freedom, Tim Briedis, an academic who specialises in the history of student activism and who also works at the University of Sydney, joins me. Tim, thanks for coming on the briefing. The arrests at Columbia and the academics walking off in support of the students feels like a defining moment. How significant are these events?
So I think there's this narrative that student protest is over, that students are just apathetic, that they're consumers, that they're not as radical or concerned with the world as they were during the Vietnam War era. I think this is a real challenge to those notions. It shows that student protest is still vibrant and active.
What exactly are these students asking from their university?
They're asking for a divestment from the Israeli military-industrial complex and to stop ties with Israel's defence companies. They're asking for an immediate ceasefire and for an end to the occupation.
Universities say there's a balancing act. They have to preserve the safety of Jewish students. From your understanding, has there been any reports of violence towards Jewish students? Because I also know that pro-peace Jewish students are part of the encampment and the protests.
Exactly. I think it's really important to not see the Jewish community as this homogenous group that's, say, all pro-Israel or all anti-Israel. Yeah, like in the New York Times, there were a couple of Jewish students quoted as saying that they stood in solidarity with the protesters and that rather than feeling threatened, they felt that sense of solidarity. Any anti-Semitism that's happened is absolutely repugnant, and it's not just morally repulsive, but incredibly damaging to the social movement of which this action is a part. So I think it's unclear exactly what has happened so far. I think one important point to reflect on is that we talk a lot. It's easy to focus on stuff going on in American universities like Columbia, but we sometimes forget about Palestinian universities and how Palestinian universities have been affected by the current bombing. For instance, I found a quote by a Jewish academic who worked and studied in Gaza online, and he says, "In Gaza, I studied at 2 universities and worked at a 3rd. Professors who taught me have been killed, colleagues have been murdered, and the campuses where I studied and worked lie mostly in ruins. The entire academic system has been obliterated by Israel's bombs. Yet here, people have the audacity to claim they are not safe because they witness students protest against their institution's complicity in human rights violations."
Yeah, that's a really powerful quote. And I guess the tension here is a subjective reality versus objective facts, that you can't dispute if a student at Columbia or Harvard or, in fact, the University of Sydney says that they don't feel safe versus the objective reality of the amount of innocent people being killed in every institution and every context in Gaza, which is what the students are essentially protesting against.
Exactly. An additional thing to add is that we need more perspectives from the protesters themselves. I think too often reporting has been about secondhand matters or about people commenting on the protest rather than being a part of them. And a lot of my research on student activism has shown that protest can be quite a beautiful, liberating moment, creating a sense of community. So I found another quote from one of the activists at Columbia, and she said, "I would say honestly, it was beautiful. I think that we have so many people who are ready to go and are dedicated and willing to basically withstand the elements to keep ourselves there and continue fighting. We just had so many beautiful prayers. We were able to sing songs. People were playing games. It was just such a sense of community." And as we further continued, it was just even more inspiring to see the student body also react and feel compelled to join in and stand in solidarity with us. I think that also really made being in the camp and sleeping in the camp that much better. So I think, protest can be a kind of utopian moment of solidarity, democracy and peace.
So from your perspective and understanding the context of student activism throughout different times in modern history, has this response been different and more heavy-handed than other peaks in student activism?
I think that it's part of a continuity. I think it has to be situated historically, and I think universities are elite institutions, and they've often been willing to discipline students who didn't play by the rules in the past. So I can give a few examples of that. So in Australia, arguably the first student activist was a guy called Guido Baracchi, who became a communist, one of the founding members of the Communist Party of Australia, and he was studying at Melbourne University during the First World War, and he was heavily involved in anti-conscription activity, and he was ultimately censured by the university and threatened with expulsion if he kept on challenging things, and he was even dumped into a pond by his fellow students. And there are a bunch of other examples on these lines. Like perhaps the most dramatic is the case of the La Trobe Three in the early 1970s. There were three young men, Barry York, Brian Polar, Fergus Robinson, who were all sent to Pentridge Prison for up to 6 months.
Wow. What were they protesting?
Anti-Vietnam War stuff, and
Right.
also the complicity of the university in the Vietnam War, specifically the Chancellor, Archibald Glenn. So it's kind of a similar issue to what's happened today, and that, they were sent to prison without trial, without sentencing. I think Barry York went to H Block, which he dubbed as hell. So it was like a pretty horrific experience. So I think that shows that universities, have been willing to discipline activist students for a long time. It's not just something that's happened today with this recent crisis.
Many people are pointing to the universities, particularly in the United States, reliance on philanthropic donors or having certain fundraising avenues which makes it hard for them to allow pro-Palestine protests. Do you think that's something that has impacted the university's freedom to allow these protests to continue?
I think it has to some extent. Like we saw with Columbia, Robert Kraft came out saying that he would withdraw funding from the university. He's a billionaire who owns the New England Patriots. So that's a significant threat. But I think it should mostly be understood as a threat against kind of the smaller universities that are more reliant on individual donors, like a Yale or a Harvard can probably shrug off the loss of a few donors, whereas the smaller universities can't. So I think that's a threat. But as I said, universities were still disciplining students in the 60s and 70s when they were primarily public funded.
Even on our shores, the University of Sydney has since set up an encampment in support of Columbia and US campuses. How is that playing out? Because the University of Sydney, which I know you're employed by, has also faced criticism that for cancelling pro-Palestine protests in the past, or it's faced criticisms that it is curbing academic freedom and student expression in terms of showing solidarity with human rights organisations and calling for ceasefire.
I'm currently doing research for a book on youth protest in Australia called Lighting a Fire, Youth Protest in Australia. But as I talked to a student activist at Sydney University as part of that research, one story that was related to me was that the student activists tried to organise a forum billed as Globalise the Intifada, and that was cancelled by the university because it was claimed that it was a terrorist threat or supporting terrorism. And I think that is hugely problematic because, the word intifada just means uprising in Arabic, as you probably know.
Yes. So what is hugely problematic? The cancellation?
I think the cancellation is problematic. Yeah, I think there would be no question that students could organise a forum about, say, the Russian Revolution or Black Lives Matter. But for some reason, Palestine seems to be a way of targeting student activists in particular.
How much freedom do you feel you have, like even in this interview? Like, are you concerned that something you say could be deemed unacceptable and have complaints lodged against you or things like that? Like, I'm just trying to understand the environment in which academia, both at the teaching level and the student level, is currently operating in?
I have been a casual academic. I'm not actually working this semester, so I feel a bit more free. But, certainly people who I've spoken to feel concerned about their jobs, that it's maybe not quite a McCarthyite sort of era, but there is a real risk, and people are making sacrifices in support of the Palestinian cause.
And more broadly, this seems to be both a left and right issue, because the Institute of Public Affairs last year released some research which suggested that the majority of universities are curtailing free speech. So do you think at this point in history, academia is getting in the way of free speech in a way that it hasn't before?
I think that, during the McCarthyite period, there were attempts to target universities in particular. Like I saw a booklet that was put out called Reducators at Harvard, for instance. Clearly there have been attempts to silence freedom of speech before, but this certainly seems like an escalation.
Yeah, because the IPA's research suggests that over the last 6 years, Australian universities' hostility towards free speech on campus has more than doubled.
There's a right-wing argument around free speech as well. Kind of the cancel culture sort of line, and allowing people who might be on the far right or are transphobic to kind of speak. I personally have been to protests against people from the far right, and I think that when people are inciting violence, it's reasonable to contest those views through disruptive action. For instance, on campus we saw Malcolm Turnbull being disrupted during a speech, which led to a couple of Sydney University students being suspended, which happened relatively recently as well. So I think there's a danger of delegitimising the protests against the far right, which I would thoroughly support.
Yeah, or conflating the two, what's currently happening and some of these arguments.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
What can we learn from other student protests when it comes to war that our governments are complicit in?
I think we can learn that student protest works, that the Vietnam War was stopped by a mass movement of students and workers. The Vietnam moratoriums, which drew hundreds of thousands of people, were the largest protests at that stage in Australian history. There were global protests against the war, and moreover, it had a permanent impact on Australian political life. For instance, conscription was ended by the Whitlam government. And even though there have been wars since Vietnam, no one has brought conscription back. And I think that's a tribute to the power of the student movement and the anti-war movement, and it shows what's possible.
That was Tim Briedis, academic historian from the University of Sydney, who is writing a book on the history of student activism. To be honest, I was surprised to learn about how harshly universities in Australia have actually come down on student protesters in the past, including sending some students to jail, despite the fact that they hadn't been charged. It's easy, I think, to see universities as liberal institutions that are bastions of academic freedom. And I guess we're reminded now that that is not always the case. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's all for this morning. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram @The Briefing Podcast, and TikTok and YouTube. We're also there. I'm Antoinette Lattouf. See you next time.
Listener.